In 1968, inside a dim naval intelligence bunker outside Sevastopol, 3 Soviet observers crowded around a flickering radar screen, convinced the Americans were once again putting on a harmless show of force. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the kind that clung to uniforms and paperwork. A dusty projector hummed in the background, replaying a grainy infrared clip of a U.S. Navy attack jet cruising just above the cloud tops, sleek, low, and eerily steady. Senior analyst Viktor Artyomov pointed at the aircraft's silhouette with a dull pencil. "An A-6 Intruder," he said with a half-smirk. "Old airframe, slow, good for practice targets maybe." He spoke with the casual arrogance of someone who had spent a lifetime dissecting American machines and filing them under inferior. Lieutenant Sokolov leaned closer to the screen. Even in infrared, the aircraft looked purposeful, wings broad, fuselage heavy, cockpit bulged forward like a fist. It wasn't graceful, but it radiated a strange confidence, the kind that made Sokolov uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. Petrov, the senior-most analyst, waved a hand dismissively. "Iranian ships are positioned well. If the Americans push too far, they'll get a warning shot." He believed it. They all did. The Iranian fleet still had functioning radar, missile banks, and a doctrine modeled partly after Soviet training. To them, the A-6 was simply a nuisance. What the Soviets didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this single intruder, gliding calmly above the Persian Gulf, wasn't on patrol. It was hunting, and it wasn't alone. The radar trace of the aircraft dipped lower. Not much, just enough to get Artyomov's attention. "Strange," he muttered. "Why drop altitude now?" No one responded. They were too busy watching the projector, where the jet rolled slightly, just a few degrees, like a predator adjusting its angle before striking. Sokolov spoke first. "Does Iran know they're coming?" Petrov chuckled. "Iran has a fleet. They'll manage." He truly believed that. He still believed it when several American aircraft abruptly vanished from Soviet receivers, not shot down, but gone entirely. A clean electronic blackout. Sokolov's pen slipped from his hand. "That's impossible. Where did they go?" Artyomov swallowed hard. "They're using full MCON, no radio, no chatter. They don't want to be seen." His voice dropped. "This is not a drill." On the projector, the intruder's outline grew sharper camera, zooming as the aircraft descended through scattered clouds. Under its wings, the ordnance finally became clear. A heavy strike load, not a defensive one. American jets did not carry that kind of weight unless they intended to use it. And for the first time that morning, the bunker went silent. They had underestimated the aircraft. They had underestimated the Navy behind it. What they were about to witness, the destruction of Iran's fleet, would not take a day, or even half a day. It would take 2 hours. And it would rewrite everything the Soviet Union thought it understood about American naval power. The grainy projection stabilized as the Soviet analysts adjusted the machine, revealing the American attack jet gliding above a broken ceiling of clouds, with a confidence that felt strangely out of place for such a supposedly outdated aircraft. The A-6 Intruder's wide, swept wings cast a faint shadow across the vapor below, while its bulbous cockpit canopy reflected sunlight like a polished visor, giving the plane an unsettlingly calm and deliberate appearance. Lieutenant Sokolov watched the footage with growing discomfort, noting how the intruder maintained a steady, almost predatory altitude, as though the pilot knew exactly when and where he intended to strike. Viktor Artyomov dismissed the aircraft with a weary exhale, insisting that its heavy loadout and sluggish silhouette proved it could not maneuver effectively against prepared naval defenses, especially those Iran had reportedly deployed across the Gulf. Petrov leaned forward and squinted at the nose of the jet, observing that its targeting systems appeared bulkier than earlier American variants, though he attributed the difference to the U.S. Navy's obsession with unnecessary modifications. The analysts had studied American planes for decades and believed they understood every weakness, from fuel inefficiency to electronic vulnerabilities, yet something about the intruder in this footage felt uncomfortably purposeful, as if the machine had been designed for a very specific kind of brutality. The aircraft's twin engines left thin ribbons of heat across the upper atmosphere, creating a wavering distortion that made the jet seem almost ghost-like as it drifted through the frame. Sokolov remarked that the plane carried more ordnance than a simple patrol route required, but Petrov assured him that Americans often flew training missions with unrealistic weapon loads, hoping to intimidate adversaries without risking escalation. What unsettled the room was not the aircraft's appearance but the discipline in its flight path, which reflected a level of composure inconsistent with a mere show of force. The Intruder held a near-perfect glide slope, neither climbing nor deviating, as though its pilot traced a line invisible to everyone, except the man in the cockpit. Artyomov tapped the display again, pointing out that the jet's wings were flexing under heavy weight, a sign that it carried live ordnance rather than inert training rounds, yet he refused to acknowledge what that implied for the unfolding situation. The Soviet intelligence team knew Iran relied on a patchwork of radar systems, many of which required manual calibration and were susceptible to atmospheric interference. But they still believed the Iranians would detect and respond to any sudden American action. As the Intruder rolled slightly left, revealing the full sweep of its underwing pylons, Sokolov inhaled sharply, realizing that the aircraft was configured for a coordinated strike rather than a symbolic demonstration. The payload looked unnervingly varied, combining precision munitions with heavier bombs intended to cripple ships rather than merely warn them. Yet Petrov continued insisting that the Iranians would retaliate quickly once the Americans breached their engagement envelope. Every detail of the jet's profile contradicted that assumption. The cockpit's tight framing, the extended refueling probe, and the subtle wobble produced by minute corrections from an experienced pilot maintaining absolute control. The footage lingered long enough for the Soviets to notice scratches across the Intruder's fuselage, the kind that only appeared on aircraft flown repeatedly into high-risk operations. A silence settled over the bunker as the reality became harder to ignore, because the plane no longer resembled a relic or a bluff, but rather a deliberate instrument of destruction, positioned at precisely the right altitude to begin a lethal descent. The Soviets recognized, too late, that the Americans were not posturing, and that the Intruder's calm glide through the clouds marked the beginning of something far more violent than anyone in the room had predicted. The more the Soviet analysts studied the Intruder's slow, deliberate movements, the more they convinced themselves that the Americans were simply engaging in another calculated gesture meant to pressure Iran without risking a genuine confrontation. Petrov leaned back with an air of confident authority, insisting that the United States had no interest in escalating beyond symbolic air passes, especially with a regional power that still possessed a functioning fleet and a sizable coastal defense network. He reminded the room that American political leaders in 1968 were already stretched across multiple global commitments, which made the idea of a full naval engagement appear strategically reckless from any reasonable perspective. Artyomov nodded along, emphasizing that Washington historically preferred controlled shows of strength rather than sudden destructive operations, a pattern the Soviets believed they had studied thoroughly. Sokolov, though less certain, allowed himself to be persuaded by the repeated arguments asserting that Iran's naval assets would provide enough of a deterrent to discourage any serious American strike. The analysts reviewed previous incidents involving U.S. forces, noting how often American pilots avoided excessive aggression to prevent provocations spiraling into unwanted regional crises. That pattern formed the backbone of their judgment, the belief that the A-6 Intruder they were watching was merely another instrument of pressure, not a vessel carrying the intent to dismantle a fleet within a single afternoon. As a result, they interpreted every precise maneuver not as preparation for coordinated violence, but as routine adjustments by a cautious pilot navigating unstable air currents above the Gulf. Their assumptions were reinforced by decades of Soviet doctrine, emphasizing the importance of layered defenses, which naturally led them to overestimate Iran's ability to respond to any unexpected threat. Petrov was adamant that Iran's radar operators, though imperfectly trained, could still detect a low-altitude strike package before it closed into weapons range, giving the fleet ample time to reposition or disperse. This conviction blinded the analysts to the subtleties in the footage, particularly the aircraft's quiet confidence and the methodical alignment of its flight path with several known weak points in Iran's defensive grid. They dismissed these cues because they conflicted with established expectations regarding American reluctance to engage in swift, decisive action without prolonged signaling or political theater. Artyomov even mocked the aircraft's design, claiming that its outdated silhouette reflected a broader pattern of American complacency and over-reliance on technology rather than disciplined strategy. In his view, the Intruder embodied the limitations of Western military thinking, which he believed favored flashy equipment over rigorous battlefield insight. He argued that Iran's fleet, supported by Soviet-style training and a basic but functional coastal command structure, would recognize and counter any genuine attempt by U.S. forces to strike their vessels directly. This perspective hardened the bunker's collective confidence, causing them to interpret unfolding events through a lens shaped more by ideology than by the evidence accumulating on the radar screen. Yet the most significant miscalculation stemmed from their unwavering belief that Iran's commanders would behave predictably, responding to American movements with disciplined precision rather than confusion or hesitation. The Soviets assumed that every Iranian radar sweep and every coastal battery remained fully operational, even though scattered intelligence reports had quietly hinted at maintenance failures and communication delays. Despite these warning signs, Petrov argued that the Iranians' Soviet-supplied equipment provided enough resilience to withstand any sudden American initiative, a conclusion that muted Sokolov's instinctive concern about the intruder's increasingly aggressive angle of approach. As the analysts continued reassuring one another, the aircraft kept descending with unwavering intent, its slow roll suggesting a pilot preparing for a coordinated assault rather than an empty demonstration. The Soviets' deep confidence in their assumptions prevented them from recognizing the pattern emerging before their eyes, blinding them to the unmistakable signs that the Americans were positioning themselves for a rapid strike. The bunker remained trapped within its own expectations, unable to imagine that the United States might abandon its usual caution and launch a devastating operation that would tear through Iran's defenses before anyone could even process what had begun. Iran's naval command had arranged its forces across the Gulf with a confidence that appeared sturdy on paper, relying on a mixture of patrol craft, coastal missile sites, and radar posts that were theoretically capable of forming a cohesive early warning network. The Soviet analysts reviewing the situation believed these assets created a wide defensive umbrella, assuming the combined systems would detect any American strike package long before it could close into effective weapons range. Several frigates patrolled the central corridor of the Gulf, supported by fast attack boats intended to harass or delay approaching aircraft long enough for heavier units to maneuver into coordinated firing positions. Along the shoreline, radar operators monitored overlapping sectors designed to minimize blind spots, though these installations required careful calibration and steady communication to maintain reliable coverage. Petrov described the Iranian grid with a tone of academic certainty, emphasizing how each vessel functioned as a node within a larger Soviet-influenced doctrine that valued redundancy over technological sophistication. He argued that even if one radar station experienced interference, the others would compensate quickly enough to prevent the Americans from exploiting any temporary gaps in detection. The analysts assumed the Iranian fleet would behave predictably in the face of unusual activity, dispersing into staggered positions that protected their more valuable ships while maintaining adequate firing arcs toward potential avenues of attack. This assumption reinforced their belief that the Americans would avoid direct engagement, since any attempt to penetrate such a structure would require precise coordination and absolute commitment from the attacking pilots. What the Soviet observers failed to appreciate was how fragile the Iranian defensive grid had become behind the facade of rigid organization, especially after months of hurried operations that stretched equipment and personnel beyond intended limits. The radar sites that looked formidable on Soviet diagrams were plagued by intermittent outages, inconsistent maintenance, and operators who often lacked the training needed to interpret complex electronic signatures. The coastal missile batteries suffered from logistical delays that left several launchers without fully serviced guidance systems, which meant their theoretical threat did not translate into practical capability. These weaknesses, though quietly acknowledged in a handful of intelligence notes, were largely dismissed by the analysts in the bunker, who preferred relying on doctrinal expectations rather than scattered field reports. Artyomov insisted that even degraded systems could still force American aircraft to adjust their attack patterns, which he believed would slow any strike long enough for Iranian vessels to reposition effectively. His confidence came from decades of studying Soviet naval doctrine, where defenses were designed to absorb punishment while retaining the ability to counterattack through force distribution and hardened command structures. However, Iran's actual command network lacked the rigid coordination required to implement such maneuvers, relying instead on small clusters of officers communicating through inconsistent radio links that often introduced fatal delays. These limitations meant that even the best-intentioned Iranian commanders struggled to interpret unfolding threats in real time, especially when facing an opponent capable of sophisticated electronic warfare. As the Intruder continued its silent descent toward the Gulf, the Soviets maintained their belief that the Iranian fleet would detect and respond decisively once the Americans committed to any aggressive action. They trusted the diagrams, the charts, and the theory behind the defensive grid, not realizing that the structure they admired existed more clearly on paper than in the actual waters beneath the aircraft's shadow. The bunker's confidence reflected an analytical inertia that prevented them from acknowledging how the gulf between theoretical capability and practical readiness could widen dramatically under real operational pressure. By assuming Iran's defenses were stronger than they truly were, the Soviet analysts created a false sense of security that blinded them to the vulnerability unfolding before their eyes, leaving them unprepared for the devastating speed with which the United States would exploit those hidden weaknesses. The first indication that something had shifted in the American formation appeared subtly on the Soviet radar display, where the Intruder's previously steady altitude wavered by only a few dozen meters, yet the movement carried an unmistakable sense of deliberate intent, rather than a simple response to atmospheric turbulence. Artyomov leaned closer to the console, noting how the aircraft's heading adjusted with a precision that suggested pre-coordinated timing rather than routine course correction, even though he still attempted to rationalize the behavior within the framework of a symbolic pass. The bunker's operators tracked several additional American aircraft, forming a loose arc behind the Intruder, and although their spacing looked innocuous at first glance, the alignment gradually tightened into a pattern that mirrored strike doctrines the Soviets had studied extensively. Sokolov observed that the surrounding aircraft were gradually reducing their radio transmissions until the channels fell into an uncanny silence, broken only by occasional bursts of encrypted signals too brief to analyze. He recognized that this reduction in chatter resembled the early stages of an attack profile, yet he hesitated to voice his concern because Petrov remained firmly convinced that the Americans lacked sufficient incentive to launch a genuine operation. The Intruder's flight path dipped again, this time angled toward a corridor known for weaknesses in Iran's radar coverage, which should have alerted even the most cautious observer to the possibility of a coordinated strike. But the analysts continued interpreting each adjustment as nothing more than pilot-level navigation. The formation's behavior became even more unsettling when the additional aircraft began to synchronize their speeds, closing the distance between airframes in a manner consistent with preparations for a multi-vector assault. Artyomov noted the emerging pattern but still insisted that the Americans were merely practicing a simulated run intended to intimidate rather than destroy, invoking previous incidents where U.S. pilots executed aggressive maneuvers without escalating into open conflict. This perspective, deeply rooted in Soviet expectations about American caution, prevented the analysts from recognizing that the U.S. Navy rarely adopted such disciplined formations unless preparing to strike with overwhelming force. As the Intruder entered a shallow banking turn that aligned it perfectly with the projected location of Iran's first frigate, Sokolov felt a tightening in his chest, sensing a coherence in the American movements that no longer matched the bunker's long-held assumptions. Every aircraft appeared to lock into position, as though following an invisible script, each change reinforcing the possibility that the Americans were executing a plan developed long before this particular encounter. The sudden absence of routine status transmissions, combined with the meticulous positioning, hinted at a fleet operating under strict electronic discipline, which was a hallmark of serious offensive action rather than a symbolic gesture. Petrov stubbornly maintained that even if the Americans intended to escalate, they would follow traditional escalation patterns involving warnings, flyovers, or controlled missile demonstrations, all of which allowed opposing forces time to react. However, nothing in the American posture resembled gradual escalation, because each adjustment pointed toward a decision already made, rather than one emerging through tentative maneuver. The Intruder's subtle descent into the cloud layer, followed by the coordinated tightening of the entire formation, symbolized a dramatic shift in operational posture that left no room for misinterpretation, except in the minds of analysts unwilling to accept the implications. By the time the bunker finally registered the growing cohesion of the American air wing, the formation had already settled into an unmistakable strike profile, leaving Iran's fragmented defenses dangerously unprepared for the speed and precision that would soon descend upon them. The Soviet observers interpreted these movements far too slowly, trapped by the belief that their doctrinal expectations held more weight than the evidence unfolding across the screens before them, and as a result, They failed to comprehend that the United States was positioning itself for a devastating first strike conducted with a clarity of purpose the bunker had not anticipated. The first sign that the situation had taken a catastrophic turn for Iran emerged not from any visible movement on the projection screen, but from a subtle distortion on the Soviet radar display, where several Iranian tracking signatures began flickering as though struggling to maintain coherence against an unseen force. Artyomov adjusted the console with mounting irritation, assuming the interference came from atmospheric conditions or equipment aging, rather than anything initiated by the Americans, who he still believed were merely posturing. However, the disruptions grew increasingly synchronized, suggesting a deliberate external influence rather than environmental coincidence, and Sokolov felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the early pattern of targeted electronic suppression. Moments later, a second wave of interference struck the Iranian grid with unsettling precision, causing entire radar nodes along the coast to dim, stagger, and then collapse into silence, leaving wide gaps in the defensive coverage that should never have appeared simultaneously. Sokolov leaned forward with a frozen stare, realizing that the Iranian operators had been forced into partial blindness without firing a single shot, while Petrov continued insisting that radar maintenance issues were common and could not be attributed to American involvement. Yet each new distortion followed a structured rhythm, as though an unseen conductor was guiding the degradation of Iran's radar network with practiced intention, which aligned perfectly with known U.S. electronic warfare tactics involving aircraft specifically designed to blind enemy sensors. The projection finally revealed the culprit when a faint infrared signature passed briefly across the edge of the screen, an aircraft flying slightly behind and above the main strike package, emitting an electronic shadow rather than a visible threat. Sokolov identified the silhouette as one consistent with U.S. electronic warfare platforms, which were capable of saturating enemy frequencies with carefully modulated bursts that overwhelmed outdated radar systems like Iran's. The realization unsettled him deeply, because such an asset would never join a formation unless the Americans intended to neutralize defenses completely before delivering a decisive blow. Petrov attempted to argue that the Iranian fleet could still rely on ship-mounted tracking systems, but even those began dropping offline as the interference propagated across multiple channels, leaving commanders with only fragmented awareness of the rapidly approaching threat. Iran's frigates, which had appeared stable and confident in the earlier diagrams, now drifted without coordination because their targeting radars failed to establish clean locks on the descending American aircraft. Artyomov's brow tightened as he watched symbols representing Iranian vessels flicker in and out of coherence, each moment of instability marking another layer of disorientation spreading through the fleet. The bunker grew increasingly silent as the analysts recognized that Iran's defensive grid was collapsing faster than they could interpret the incoming data, with communication disruptions compounding the radar failures until entire sections of the Gulf became invisible to Iranian command. The Americans, still maintaining perfect radio silence, advanced with a level of coordination that suggested absolute confidence in their ability to dismantle the remaining defenses without encountering significant resistance. Artyomov finally acknowledged the pattern with a subdued voice, admitting that the interference was far too synchronized to be accidental and must have been orchestrated by a highly trained electronic warfare unit operating in direct support of the strike package. Despite this realization, the analysts were unprepared for how helpless the Iranian fleet appeared once the jamming reached full intensity, because every tactical assumption they had made relied on the belief that Iran's radar coverage would survive long enough to issue warnings or reposition assets. Instead, the American suppression erased Iran's situational awareness within minutes, transforming the fleet into a collection of isolated ships unable to coordinate or defend themselves effectively. The Soviets watched the display with creeping dread as the Intruder descended deeper into the compromised corridor, now shielded not only by altitude and timing, but by the total blindness inflicted upon Iran's defensive network. And for the first time since the encounter began, the analysts understood that the Americans were not testing boundaries or sending a message. They were executing a meticulously prepared plan to dismantle an entire naval force before it could comprehend the scale of the threat approaching through the clouds. The moment the first Iranian radar post collapsed into total silence, the Intruder dipped beneath the final layer of scattered clouds with an elegance that felt disturbingly intentional, as though the pilot had been waiting for precisely this window to expose the aircraft's full predatory posture. Its wide wings steadied against the shifting wind, as the jet descended into the narrow corridor created by the electronic suppression, positioning itself exactly where no Iranian sensor could reliably track or identify an incoming threat. In the Soviet bunker, Sokolov watched the projection with a tightening jaw, noting how the aircraft appeared to glide rather than dive, maintaining a level of precision that suggested long-rehearsed familiarity with the vulnerabilities of Iran's defensive grid. Artyomov leaned forward as the intruder's silhouette sharpened, its belly now clearly showing the heavy strike ordnance intended not for intimidation, but for decisive destruction. He had spent decades studying American aircraft, and yet had never seen the A-6 flown with such ruthless efficiency, which unsettled him far more than the jamming patterns that had overtaken Iran's radar systems. The jet's engines steadied into a deep, unwavering hum as it leveled out at a dangerously low altitude, tracing a direct line toward the first Iranian frigate with unwavering commitment. When the aircraft released its opening salvo, the feed captured only a brief shimmer beneath the fuselage before a cluster of munitions arced downward, disappearing into the haze surrounding the unsuspecting warship. A heartbeat later, a bright flash erupted across the screen, followed by a rolling bloom of smoke that expanded with horrifying speed along the ship's forward deck. The Soviet analysts froze in collective disbelief, struggling to reconcile the magnitude of the explosion with their previous assumptions about American hesitation and Iran's defensive capabilities. None of them had expected the first strike to hit with such devastating accuracy, nor had they imagined that the intruder's attack would neutralize a primary Iranian vessel before any warning could be transmitted across the fleet. Sokolov muttered that the frigate's radar signature had vanished instantly, not degraded or interrupted, but erased in a single violent moment, leaving a jagged void on the display where a fully operational warship had been minutes earlier. Petrov argued weakly that secondary systems might still function, yet even he could see the plume rising too quickly and too cleanly for the ship to retain any meaningful combat capability. The intruder had not merely damaged the vessel, it had removed it from the tactical equation entirely, demonstrating a level of lethality that contradicted every assumption the bunker had made about the Americans' willingness to use force. The aircraft pulled away with a smooth banking turn that revealed its next target and, more importantly, revealed the coordinated movement of additional American strike fighters converging behind it. This shift confirmed that the first hit was not an isolated display, but part of a broader sequence designed to dismantle Iran's fleet in rapid succession. Artyomov realized with growing dread that the Americans had timed their attack so precisely that the second wave would strike before Iranian commanders could process the destruction of their first frigate. The Soviet analysts had always assumed that American pilots favored gradual application of force, yet the unfolding pattern reflected a doctrine built on overwhelming dominance delivered within the shortest possible window. The bunker remained silent as the smoke expanded across the projection, its dark plume rising like a stark reminder of how quickly assumptions could collapse in the face of disciplined execution. Sokolov exhaled slowly, acknowledging that the Americans had not merely entered Iranian airspace but had done so with an operational clarity that left no room for hesitation or misinterpretation. The strike had been swift, calculated, and entirely unopposed, revealing not only Iran's vulnerabilities but also the United States Navy's willingness to exploit those weaknesses with surgical precision. For the first time since the incident began, the Soviet observers understood the scale of the operation unfolding before them, realizing that the destruction of one ship was merely the opening note, signaling a devastating symphony of coordinated strikes that would tear through the remaining fleet with relentless momentum. The destruction of the first Iranian frigate sent a tremor through the bunker, not because the analysts believed the warship was irreplaceable, but because its instantaneous disappearance exposed how unprepared the remaining vessels were for an attack executed with such precision and speed. As the smoke bloomed across the projection, a second set of American aircraft emerged from the cloud layer, their silhouettes forming a tight formation that moved with deliberate synchronization toward the next ship in the Iranian line. Artyomov tried to follow the movement on the radar display, yet the system struggled to maintain lock on the rapidly descending signatures, which only reinforced the growing realization that the Iranian defensive grid had been compromised beyond recovery. Sokolov watched the symbols flicker as Iran's communication channels erupted with fragmented bursts of uncoordinated transmissions, each message overlapping another in a chaotic attempt to establish situational awareness. These transmissions were filled with enough interference to prevent coherent orders from forming, suggesting that multiple commanders were attempting to speak simultaneously, unaware that their messages were dissolving into static before reaching the fleet. Petrov pressed his palms flat against the table, insisting that the Iranian vessels would still respond once they regained composure, although the tension in his voice betrayed an underlying fear that the Americans had struck far deeper than he initially believed. A moment later, the second strike unfolded with terrifying clarity when a pair of American aircraft released their payload simultaneously, sending two streams of ordnance sweeping across the deck of another Iranian frigate. The impact detonated in a blinding flash that momentarily overwhelmed the projection feed, creating a wave of distortion that rippled across the bunker's dim lighting. When the image stabilized, the analysts saw flames racing across the ship's superstructure, engulfing radar masts and communication antennas in seconds, effectively silencing the vessel before its crew could mount any meaningful response. The frigate's heat signature expanded uncontrollably, signaling that its internal systems had failed catastrophically, leaving it unable to coordinate with the rest of the fleet. The shock of losing a second major vessel so quickly sent Iran's command network into further disarray, amplifying the sense of isolation that now defined each ship's tactical picture. Several Iranian patrol boats attempted to reposition into defensive arcs, yet their movements appeared hesitant and disjointed, as if the absence of central direction had stripped them of any coherent tactical purpose. Artyomov observed that these boats were drifting into each other's paths, creating overlapping wake patterns that suggested confusion rather than strategy, while American aircraft maneuvered with unbroken focus along predetermined vectors. Sokolov pointed to another radar symbol that began pulsing irregularly, indicating the presence of a third Iranian vessel attempting to activate its fire control systems despite the ongoing interference. However, the ship's targeting radar sputtered under continuous electronic assault, leaving it unable to secure a stable lock on any approaching aircraft. Before the operators could stabilize their systems, a cluster of bombs struck near the vessel's stern, sending a violent plume of water and flames skyward as the ship's propulsion failed spectacularly. The warship slowed to a crawl, drifting helplessly as fires spread along its deck, turning its silhouette into a fractured mass of heat and smoke that flickered across the Soviet projection. The bunker absorbed the scene in horrified silence, realizing that the Americans had not merely opened an attack but had effectively dismantled half of Iran's naval presence in a matter of minutes. Each strike revealed new vulnerabilities in Iran's structure, making it clear that the fleet had never been capable of responding as a unified force, because its defensive assumptions relied on technologies and doctrines that crumbled under sustained electronic warfare. Petrov finally conceded that the Americans had planned their assault with far greater precision than any Soviet analysis had predicted, using synchronized timing and layered execution to exploit every weakness inherent in Iran's fragmented network. By the time the flames from the third destroyed vessel illuminated the dark Gulf waters, the Soviet analysts understood that the remaining Iranian ships would fall just as swiftly because the Americans had already seized absolute control of the engagement's momentum. The operation was unfolding like a series of perfectly timed blows, each landing with enough force to ensure the next would be easier, creating a chain reaction far more devastating than the bunker had believed possible only moments earlier. The rapid destruction of 3 Iranian vessels created a widening gulf of fear and confusion across the fleet, allowing the American strike groups to advance with an aggressiveness that no one in the Soviet bunker had anticipated only minutes earlier. As additional waves of U.S. aircraft descended from the cloud layer, their ordnance bays already prepared for follow-on attacks, the analysts witnessed a level of coordination that felt more like a single organism acting with unified purpose, rather than multiple pilots responding independently. Sokolov noted that each aircraft moved in harmony with the others, adjusting altitude and speed with uncanny precision, as though the entire formation shared one continuous tactical awareness, shaped by real-time intelligence, far superior to anything Iran had available. Meanwhile, the Iranian fleet struggled desperately to reorganize, but their attempts resembled scattered improvisation rather than any coherent countermeasure, since most vessels lacked reliable communication links to coordinate even basic maneuvers. Patrol boats zigzagged through the surf in confused patterns that revealed their crews' panic, while larger frigates attempted to rotate their damaged radar masts toward incoming threats despite lacking functional targeting systems. Artyomov watched these movements with a sinking feeling, recognizing that the fleet's disintegration stemmed not only from American strikes, but also from a systemic collapse of command that eliminated any chance of forming a defensive perimeter. The Iranian ships were isolated, blinded, and operating on instinct, which made them easy prey for attackers who approached with calculated confidence. The second American wave delivered its strike with mechanical precision, targeting vessels that still possessed partial operational capability, ensuring that no ship could mount even a token resistance. Bombs and missiles impacted with devastating consistency, turning decks into fields of fire and leaving superstructures mangled beyond recognition within seconds of the initial explosions. The projection screen flickered under the intense glare of these strikes, briefly overwhelming the bunker's outdated equipment as new plumes of flame erupted across the Gulf's dark surface. Petrov attempted to catalog the damage but quickly abandoned the effort, realizing that his notes could not keep pace with the speed at which the American attacks were unfolding. Sokolov pointed out that many Iranian vessels attempted evasive turns, only to collide with the wakes of nearby ships, creating erratic patterns that made them even more vulnerable to incoming ordnance. The Americans exploited these chaotic movements without hesitation, launching precision strikes that neutralized engines, communications arrays, and primary weapon systems with cold efficiency. Every successful hit widened the gaps between the remaining vessels, further eroding any possibility of restoring coordinated action or stabilizing the rapidly deteriorating situation. The fleet had lost not only its combat strength, but also its ability to understand the battlefield at all, leaving each commander trapped inside a shrinking envelope of uncertainty. The Soviet analysts were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth as the operation accelerated beyond all doctrinal expectations. The Americans had mastered the art of overwhelming momentum, using synchronized timing and layered suppression to ensure that no target survived long enough to contribute meaningfully to the fight. This realization carried heavy implications, because it meant the United States was capable of executing high-speed naval destruction without exposing its own forces to significant counterfire. Artyomov whispered that the operation resembled a testing ground rather than a battle, as though the United States Navy was demonstrating a future style of warfare built on absolute information dominance and surgical application of force. As the flames from yet another Iranian vessel illuminated the sea, the bunker finally understood that the operation had advanced beyond a simple punitive strike and evolved into a systematic dismantling of Iran's maritime power. The Americans were no longer reacting to threats or punishing provocation. They were imposing a new reality in which the enemy's fleet ceased to exist before meaningful resistance could begin. With each passing minute, the engagement grew more lopsided, and the analysts realized they were witnessing not an exchange of force, but a one-sided erasure executed with breathtaking speed and precision. By the time the second wave completed its assault, the Soviet observers recognized that the Iranian Navy no longer functioned as a fighting entity, because the Americans had seized not only the physical space of the battlefield, but also the tempo, rhythm, and unfolding narrative of the engagement itself. The deeper the Soviet analysts studied the unfolding battle, the more they realized that the engagement had already surpassed every predictive model they had relied upon to evaluate American naval capabilities, revealing weaknesses in their own assumptions that they had never considered possible. Artyomov stared at the display with a tightening expression, observing how each American strike followed the previous one with perfect rhythm, leaving almost no interval for Iran to recover or reorient. He muttered that the tempo resembled a pre-programmed sequence, rather than human decision-making, suggesting that the Americans had refined their doctrine into a seamless cycle of suppression, strike, and reposition that outpaced any defensive structure modeled in Soviet war planning. This revelation unsettled him deeply, because it contradicted decades of analysis asserting that U.S. forces preferred measured engagements rather than high-velocity overwhelm. Sokolov felt as though he were watching an entirely new form of warfare, one defined not by incremental tactical exchanges but by instantaneous dominance engineered through layered precision and flawless timing. He noted that the Americans never repeated the same attack vector twice, constantly shifting approach angles in ways that prevented even theoretical counterfire from gaining traction. Every Iranian attempt to regroup dissolved under the weight of American coordination, exposing a critical flaw in Soviet assumptions about Iran's ability to autonomously interpret threats under electronic duress. What shocked him most was the consistency of the damage inflicted, because no strike appeared wasted, and no aircraft lingered in vulnerable positions long enough to risk retaliation. Petrov attempted to salvage his earlier confidence by pointing out that Iran's equipment had always been prone to maintenance failures, but even he could no longer deny that the Americans were demonstrating operational mastery far beyond anything the Soviet naval doctrine had prepared them to counter. He watched the projection as another vessel's heat signature collapsed into a chaotic mass, realizing that the Iranian fleet was not merely being defeated, but systematically deconstructed with a clarity of purpose that left no space for improvisation or resistance. The Americans appeared to anticipate every possible Iranian response, hitting each ship with exactly the type of ordnance most effective against its remaining capabilities. This level of tailored destruction felt more like an exact science than traditional combat, making the analysts question whether the United States had perfected a strike methodology so refined that it bordered on mechanical inevitability. As the room absorbed these implications, the bunker's atmosphere transformed from tense vigilance to a dawning recognition that their understanding of American strategy had been fundamentally incomplete. Artyomov admitted quietly that none of their doctrinal predictions accounted for this kind of operational velocity, especially the near-instant collapse of a multi-ship defensive formation under sustained electronic isolation. He understood now that the Americans were not simply executing a superior tactical plan, but applying a form of integrated warfare that merged intelligence, suppression, and strike capabilities into a single, continuous action. This realization challenged the very foundation of Soviet naval theory, which relied heavily on the assumption that no technologically advanced adversary could maintain such perfect cohesion under real-world combat conditions. Sokolov felt a chill settle across his shoulders as he studied the synchronized movements of the American aircraft, recognizing that their strategy was not evolving in response to the battle but unfolding exactly as intended. The Americans had entered the engagement with flawless knowledge of Iran's weaknesses and the precise sequencing required to exploit them before meaningful resistance could form. Every second that passed reinforced the idea that the United States had achieved something far more significant than a simple tactical victory. They had demonstrated a practical blueprint for maritime annihilation, conducted at a pace no traditional fleet could counter. The Soviets realized that if this methodology were ever directed toward a more capable opponent, the results could be catastrophic on a scale none of their planning documents had ever contemplated. By the time the flames from the latest destroyed vessel lit the surface of the Gulf, the analysts understood that their predictive models had not merely been inaccurate but dangerously obsolete, leaving them unprepared to confront the unsettling truth revealed by the unfolding operation. The United States Navy possessed the ability to erase a fleet not through overwhelming numbers, but through overwhelming speed, precision, and unified execution. The more the American assault unfolded across the projection screens, the more the Soviet analysts felt an unfamiliar type of dread settling into the bunker, a heavy realization that the United States was demonstrating a capability far more consequential than the destruction of a regional navy. Artyomov stood stiffly beside the console, recognizing with growing unease that the sequence of strikes revealed a level of operational maturity capable of overwhelming not just Iran's fragmented forces, but any fleet lacking comparable electronic resilience. He whispered that if such a strike pattern were applied to a more sophisticated navy, the initial losses alone could cripple an entire theater before reinforcements had time to mobilize, leaving commanders with nothing but shattered fragments of their former defensive posture. Sokolov watched another Iranian vessel vanish beneath a bloom of fire, and for the first time since the incident began, he imagined the same level of precision being directed at Soviet formations, particularly those stationed in the Baltic or Black Sea, where geography restricted maneuvering options. The thought unsettled him deeply, because the confined waters of Soviet theaters would only amplify the Americans' ability to compress engagement ranges and exploit vulnerabilities before Soviet ships could establish overlapping defensive arcs. He realized that their doctrine, built on layered missile platforms and tightly coordinated task groups, depended heavily on early detection to survive an incoming assault, yet the American operation demonstrated a capacity to erase that early detection entirely within minutes. Petrov felt the weight of this implication as he studied the radar signatures, which continued collapsing with mechanical consistency across the Gulf, leaving the Iranian fleet blind